Here's something that might sound a little uncomfortable at first. The way people treat you is not random. It's not luck. It's not fate. And it's definitely not just about who they are. It's about you. Or more specifically, how you show up. Most people spend years trying to be liked, trying to be understood, trying to prove their worth. And somehow, they still feel overlooked, disrespected, or taken for granted. That's the paradox. The more they chase approval, the less they receive real respect. And if you've ever felt that frustration, like you're doing everything right but something still feels off, you're not alone. Now, here's the counterintuitive part. What if the solution isn't doing more, but doing less? Less explaining, less reacting, less seeking validation. Sounds strange, right? But from a psychology perspective, people don't respond to effort the way you think. They respond to perception. And that means a single internal shift can change everything externally. This is where the thinking of Niccolo Machiavelli becomes surprisingly relevant. He understood something most people ignore. It's not enough to be something, you have to be seen as it. And that changes the game completely. Because here's the truth no one tells you clearly. Being kind doesn't guarantee respect. Being available doesn't guarantee value. And being agreeable often does the opposite of what you expect. It lowers your perceived worth. Why? Because there's no scarcity. There's no tension. There's no reason for people to adjust their behavior around you. And without that, your self-respect slowly gets traded for temporary approval. It feels good in the moment, but costs you in the long run. The real question is, what if you could flip that dynamic without becoming someone fake or manipulative? That's exactly what you're about to understand. Not through surface-level advice, but through a deeper lens. One that connects emotional independence, boundaries, and the subtle signals you send every single day. Because once you see how these pieces fit together, you can't go back to the old patterns. You start noticing things differently. Conversations feel different. Reactions feel different. And most importantly, people start treating you differently. Not because you asked them to, but because your presence changed. So if there was one thing you could shift, one internal decision that quietly reshapes your entire external reality, would you be willing to look at it differently? He often says it quietly, almost like a confession. Most people don't even realize they're living for approval. It shows up in subtle ways, laughing at jokes that weren't funny, agreeing just to avoid tension, shrinking their own voice to fit the room. From a psychology standpoint, it's a survival instinct, sure, but left unchecked, it erodes self-respect over time. The person starts trading authenticity for acceptance, and, ironically, ends up less respected. It's like trying to hold water in your hands. The tighter you grip, the faster it slips away. And here's the twist. People can feel that neediness, even if no one says it out loud. Perception begins to shift, and not in your favor. What feels like connection often becomes quiet dismissal. He recalls a moment from his early career, saying yes to everything, staying late, over-delivering, hoping it would earn admiration. But instead of respect, he got more demands, more pressure, and less recognition. That's the paradox of approval seeking. The more you give without boundaries, the more people take. It's almost Machiavellian in nature. People respond not to effort, but to signals of value and control. When someone lacks emotional independence, they become predictable, easy to read, easy to use, and no one consciously decides to disrespect them. It just happens, slowly, through repeated patterns. Scarcity of self-worth leads to abundance of exploitation. Funny how that works, right? Now think about everyday situations. A friend cancels plans last minute, and instead of addressing it, you brush it off with no worries, even though it bothered you. Or someone interrupts you constantly, and you just let it slide. These are small moments, but they stack up. Each time, your perception in their eyes adjusts a little. Not because they're bad people, but because you're teaching them how to treat you. Psychology calls this behavioral reinforcement. What you tolerate, you reinforce. And when you consistently avoid friction, you unintentionally signal that your time, your voice, your presence isn't that valuable. That's a hard pill to swallow, but an important one. He often compares it to a marketplace. Imagine you're selling something valuable, but you keep lowering the price just to make a sale. At first, people might buy, but over time, they start questioning the value itself. Why is it so cheap? They wonder. That's exactly what happens when self-respect is compromised. You become accessible, available, agreeable, but not respected. Scarcity disappears, and with it, perceived worth. Machiavelli hinted at this centuries ago. Value is not just what you offer, but how you present it. And if you're always available, always accommodating, you remove the very tension that creates interest. There's also an emotional cost that people rarely talk about. Living for approval is exhausting. You're constantly scanning reactions, overanalyzing tone, adjusting behavior. It's like being on stage all the time, performing a version of yourself you think others will accept. Over time, that creates internal conflict. Who are you really when no one's watching? Emotional independence becomes almost impossible because your identity is tied to external validation. And here's the kicker. People don't deeply respect someone who doesn't respect themselves. It's not cruelty, it's human nature. Perception follows patterns, not intentions. He doesn't say this to criticize, but to wake something up. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. The need for approval isn't the real problem. It's the unconscious surrender of your boundaries that follows. And once that line is crossed, everything else starts to shift. The way people speak to you, the way they treat your time, even the opportunities that come your way. It all traces back to this subtle dynamic. But if that's the problem, then what actually shapes how people see you in the first place? He leans in a little when he says this, because most people underestimate it. The world doesn't respond to who you are. It responds to how you're perceived. That might sound unfair at first, but it's deeply rooted in psychology and human behavior. People don't have access to your intentions, your struggles, or your inner values. They only see signals, your posture, your tone, your timing, your reactions, and from those fragments, they build a version of you in their minds. That version becomes your reality. It's almost like a silent agreement everyone participates in, without ever discussing it. This is where the thinking of Niccolo Machiavelli becomes strikingly relevant. He understood that perception often outweighs truth in social dynamics. A person may be kind, intelligent, and capable, but if they present themselves with hesitation, insecurity, or excessive compliance, others won't interpret those inner qualities. They'll respond to what's visible. And what's visible is confidence, or the lack of it. That's why two people with the same skill level can be treated completely differently. One commands attention, the other gets overlooked. Not because of ability, but because of perception. He once shared an example that's hard to ignore. Picture two individuals walking into a room. One enters quietly, avoids eye contact, waits to be acknowledged. The other walks in calmly, shoulders relaxed, makes brief eye contact, speaks when appropriate, not rushing to prove anything. Same room, same people, but completely different reactions. Why? Because one communicates emotional independence, while the other signals uncertainty. And people, consciously or not, gravitate towards stability. They respect what appears grounded, not what appears seeking approval. It's subtle, but incredibly powerful. Now here's where it gets practical. If someone constantly apologizes for things that don't require an apology, sorry for asking, sorry for taking your time, they slowly lower their perceived value, not because they're polite, but because they position themselves as less deserving. On the other hand, someone who communicates clearly, without over-explaining or over-justifying, reinforces their self-respect. They don't need to announce it. It shows in their behavior. Boundaries become visible through tone, through timing, through presence, and over time, people adjust accordingly. He likes to use a simple analogy. Think of perception like a lens. You might be offering something valuable, but if the lens is distorted, that value won't be seen clearly. And the truth is, you are responsible for that lens, not by pretending to be someone else, but by aligning your external signals with your internal standards. That's where most people struggle. They feel one thing inside, but project another outside. And that inconsistency creates confusion. Scarcity of clarity leads to misinterpretation, and misinterpretation shapes how people treat you. What's fascinating is that once you start becoming aware of this, you begin to notice patterns everywhere. Who gets interrupted? Who doesn't? Who is taken seriously? Who is brushed off? It's rarely random. It's usually tied to how each person presents themselves over time. And that realization can feel uncomfortable, because it means you have more control than you thought. But if perception is shaping your reality, then what happens when you stop reacting to it and start anchoring yourself internally instead? Before we go deeper, let me tell you something important. If what you've heard so far feels uncomfortably accurate, if you're starting to realize how much perception shapes the way people treat you, then you need to read this. I created an ebook called The Silent Influence Code: How to Make People Respect, Desire, and Follow You Without Saying a Word. Inside, you'll discover the hidden psychology behind status, attraction, emotional independence, and the subtle behaviors that instantly change how people see you. This isn't motivational fluff. It's strategic, practical, and built for real-life interactions. So if you're tired of being ignored, overlooked, or underestimated, click the link in the pinned comment and get access to it now. Because the next thing you're about to learn will hit very differently once you understand the game behind human behavior. He pauses here, because this is where everything begins to change. Emotional independence isn't loud, it's not flashy, and it doesn't seek attention. It's quiet, almost invisible, but incredibly powerful. It's the moment a person stops needing applause to feel worthy and stops fearing criticism as if it defines them. From a psychology perspective, this is a shift from external validation to internal stability. Instead of asking, "Do they like me?" the question becomes, "Do I respect myself in this moment?" That single shift rewires behavior in ways most people don't expect. And interestingly, it changes how others respond almost immediately. He often explains it with a simple image. Most people act like a thermometer. They rise and fall based on the environment. If they receive praise, they feel confident. If they face rejection, they shrink. But someone with emotional independence acts like a thermostat. They set the temperature. Their state doesn't depend on the room. The room adjusts to them. That's not arrogance. It's stability. And stability is deeply attractive because it signals control. Not control over others, but over oneself. And that's where self-respect becomes visible without a single word being spoken. He remembers a situation where someone criticized his work in a meeting. Years ago, he would have over-explained, defended himself, maybe even apologized unnecessarily. But this time, he simply listened, nodded, and responded calmly. That's one way to look at it. No tension, no need to prove anything. And something interesting happened. The dynamic shifted. The person who criticized him softened. Why? Because there was no emotional hook to grab onto. When you don't react impulsively, you remove the leverage others unconsciously test. That's a very Machiavelli-like principle. Power often lies in what you don't do. Now, this doesn't mean becoming cold or indifferent. That's a common misunderstanding. Emotional independence isn't about not caring. It's about not being controlled. You can still appreciate praise, but you don't depend on it. You can still hear criticism, but you don't collapse under it. It creates a space between stimulus and response. And in that space, you choose who you are. That's where boundaries start to form naturally, not as rigid walls, but as quiet decisions. And people feel that they may not articulate it, but their perception adjusts. Think about someone you admire. Chances are, they don't chase approval. They don't overreact. They don't bend under pressure. There's a sense of groundedness, a kind of calm certainty. That's not accidental. It's built. And it often comes from repeated moments of choosing self-respect over immediate comfort. Saying no when it's easier to say yes. Staying silent when others expect a reaction. Walking away when something doesn't align. These are small acts, but they accumulate. And over time, they create a presence that feels unshakable. But here's where it gets interesting. Once you stop reacting emotionally to everything, people start to notice. Some will respect it, Others might test it. They'll push a little, challenge a little, just to see if that stability is real. And that's where most people slip back into old patterns. Because maintaining emotional independence in theory is easy, but in real social situations, under pressure, that's a different game. So the question becomes, how do you respond when people start testing your limits without even saying it out loud? He usually smiles a little here, because once you see it, it's everywhere. People are constantly testing each other, not in obvious, dramatic ways, but through small, almost invisible actions. An interruption during your sentence, a dismissive tone, a delayed response, a subtle joke at your expense. These are what psychology would call micro-tests, and most people fail them, not because they're weak, but because they're unaware. They laugh it off, ignore it, or overcompensate to avoid tension. But every time that happens, a silent message is sent. You can push me, and I won't push back. That's how perception starts to shift. He once described it like this. Imagine someone cuts you off mid-sentence repeatedly. If you stay quiet every time, you're not being polite. You're training them. You're reinforcing a pattern. But if you calmly say, hold on, I wasn't finished, without aggression, something changes. It's not about confrontation. It's about clarity. That's a boundary. And boundaries, when expressed with calm certainty, don't create conflict. They create structure. People might be surprised at first, maybe even uncomfortable, but deep down, they respect it. Because you're showing self-respect in action, not just in theory. This is where many misunderstand the influence of Machiavelli. They think it's about manipulation or control over others. But in reality, it's about understanding dynamics. Power doesn't always come from force. It often comes from composure. When someone tests you and you react emotionally, you give them information. You reveal where you're sensitive, where you can be influenced. But when you respond with measured calm, you become harder to read, harder to move. That creates a kind of psychological scarcity. People don't fully know how to approach you, and that uncertainty increases your perceived strength. He shares a simple, practical approach. Next time someone makes a subtle, disrespectful comment, instead of laughing it off automatically, pause, look at them briefly, then either redirect or address it lightly. What do you mean by that? No aggression, no drama, just clarity. You'd be surprised how often people backtrack, not because they're afraid, but because they weren't expecting resistance. Most social tests are unconscious. People aren't plotting, they're probing. And when they meet someone with emotional independence, the probing stops. There's also the fear factor. Many avoid setting boundaries because they fear rejection or conflict. What if they don't like me anymore? But here's the truth. If someone only respects you when you're agreeable, that's not respect. It's convenience. Real respect comes with a bit of tension, a bit of distance. That's where scarcity plays its role again. When you're not always easy to access, not always predictable, your presence gains weight. People start thinking twice before crossing certain lines, not because you demanded it, but because you demonstrated it. And over time, something subtle but powerful happens. The same people who once interrupted, dismissed, or overlooked you begin to adjust. They listen more. They choose their words more carefully. They give you space. Not because you forced them, but because your behavior reshaped their perception. And that shift opens the door to something even more interesting. What happens when you combine boundaries with silence and start using your presence more strategically? He lowers his voice a bit when he talks about this, almost as if demonstrating the very principle. In a world where everyone is talking, explaining, posting, reacting, silence becomes powerful. Not awkward silence, but intentional silence. The kind that comes from emotional independence, not insecurity. From a psychology angle, people are naturally curious about what they don't fully understand. When someone speaks less, reveals less, and doesn't rush to fill every gap, it creates space. And in that space, perception starts to elevate their value. It's subtle, but incredibly effective. He once noticed this in a meeting. One person kept talking, trying to prove their competence, adding more and more points. Another person spoke only once, but when they did, everyone listened. Why? Because their words carried weight. they weren't diluted by overexposure. That's the principle of scarcity in action. When something is always available, it loses perceived importance. But when it's limited, controlled, and intentional, it becomes valuable. The same applies to your presence, your opinions, even your availability. Less noise, more impact. This doesn't mean becoming distant or unapproachable. That's a mistake many make. It's not about withdrawing. It's about choosing when and how to engage. For example, instead of replying instantly to every message, take your time when possible. Instead of sharing every thought, share what truly adds value. These small shifts communicate self-respect without saying a word. They signal that your time and attention are not endlessly available, and people, whether consciously or not, adjust their behavior based on that signal. Machiavelli would say, "You're shaping the stage without announcing it." He often compares it to a spotlight. If the light is always on, people stop noticing it. But if it turns on selectively, it draws attention immediately. That's how silence works when used strategically. It creates contrast, and contrast shapes perception. When you're not constantly reacting, not constantly explaining yourself, you become less predictable, and unpredictability, when grounded in stability, creates intrigue. People start wondering, observing, paying closer attention, not because you asked for it, but because your presence feels different. There's also a deeper layer to this. Silence protects your energy. When you don't feel the need to respond to everything, to justify every action, you conserve mental space. That space strengthens emotional independence. You're no longer pulled into every interaction, every opinion, every minor conflict. And that detachment isn't cold, it's selective. It allows you to engage where it matters and step back where it doesn't. Boundaries become quieter, but stronger. And over time, people learn that access to you isn't automatic, it's earned. And here's where it all starts to come together. When you combine silence with scarcity, and scarcity with self-respect, your entire dynamic shifts. People begin to value your time, your words, your presence differently. But with that shift comes something else: resistance. Not everyone will respond positively to this change. Some will test you harder. Some will question you. Some may even pull away. And that's exactly where the real transformation begins. He takes a slower tone here, because this is where most people hesitate. The transformation isn't dramatic on the outside. It's internal, quiet, almost invisible at first. But make no mistake, it's one of the most powerful shifts a person can go through. Over time, by applying these principles, the individual becomes untouchable. Not in an arrogant way, but in a grounded, self-assured way. Their emotional independence is no longer something they practice. It becomes who they are. And from a psychology perspective, consistency is what rewires, not just behavior, but identity itself. At this stage, reactions become rare. Situations that once triggered anxiety, overthinking, or the need for approval simply don't carry the same weight anymore. Someone cancels plans. Fine. Someone disagrees. That's okay too. There's no rush to fix, prove, or chase. That's the essence of self-respect. It removes urgency from external validation. And interestingly, this calm detachment changes how others behave. Perception shifts again, but this time, it stabilizes. People sense that they can't easily influence your emotional state. And when that happens, the dynamic changes permanently. He remembers someone asking, "But won't people think I've changed?" And he nodded, because they will. Some will say you've become distant. Others might say you're harder to read. But what they're really noticing is the absence of your old patterns. The over-explaining, the constant availability, the subtle need for approval, it's gone. And that absence creates scarcity. Not just of your time, but of your reactions. And when reactions are scarce, they become meaningful. Every word, every response carries more weight. That's not manipulation, it's alignment. Of course, this transformation isn't always comfortable. There will be moments where the old habits try to come back. Moments where staying silent feels unnatural, where setting a boundary feels risky. And there will be resistance, from others and from within. but that's part of the process. As Machiavelli understood, power isn't given. It's built through consistency and clarity. And here, power doesn't mean control over others, but mastery over self. The ability to remain steady, even when situations are uncertain or emotionally charged. He often shares a simple truth. People adjust to the version of you that you consistently present, not the version you intend to be, not the version you explain, but the one you demonstrate daily. That's why this transformation takes time. It's not about one strong moment, but repeated small decisions, choosing not to react impulsively, choosing to maintain boundaries, choosing to protect your energy. These choices stack up, and over time, they reshape your identity. And once that identity becomes stable, it's incredibly difficult for others to disrupt it. And that's when something interesting happens. Relationships become cleaner, more respectful, more intentional. The right people stay, the wrong ones fade. Opportunities begin to align differently, not because the world changed, but because you did. And while this might seem like the final step, there's still something deeper to uncover. Because what if one single shift could accelerate all of this, faster than most people ever imagine? Now let him ask you something honestly. How long are you going to keep playing a role that slowly drains your self-respect, just to be accepted? How many times have you stayed silent when you should have spoken, said yes when you meant no, or adjusted yourself just to avoid discomfort? Take a moment and really think about it. Because everything you've just read isn't theory. It's practical psychology that shapes your daily life. And the truth is simple. If nothing changes, nothing changes. So what's stopping you from applying even one of these principles today? What would happen if, just once, you chose emotional independence over approval? If you held a boundary instead of avoiding tension? If you allowed a little scarcity into your presence instead of being constantly available? It might feel uncomfortable at first, sure, but isn't it more uncomfortable to keep being underestimated, overlooked, or taken for granted? The shift doesn't require perfection. It requires awareness and consistency. Small actions, repeated over time, reshape how people see you. And perception, as you now understand, shapes reality. So here's a challenge for you. Starting today, notice the moments where you usually seek validation. Pause, breathe, choose differently. It could be something simple. Speaking a little slower, not over-explaining, or calmly asserting yourself in a conversation. These are not big moves, but they carry weight, and over time, they build something powerful. A version of you that people can't easily manipulate, ignore, or disrespect. A version grounded in self-respect, not approval. That's where real change begins. Now, I'm curious. Which of these ideas hit you the hardest? Where do you see yourself in these patterns? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd genuinely like to hear your perspective. And if this made you think differently, even for a moment, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Because this is just the beginning of a deeper journey into understanding people, power, and yourself.